Today's lesson is on Texas water management. I want to talk a little bit about the laws, the entities that govern Texas water, one of the main problems that Texas faces over the next 50 years or so, and a little bit about how they're planning to solve it. So the Texas legislature is, of course, the main entity for Texas law, water law, and Texas, conservation and regulation and so forth. So the legislature makes and revises state water law. It decides how much money the state water agencies get through appropriations bills. It sets the requirements for creating local water entities, regional water entities, and so forth. There's a Natural Resources Committee in the House and a Natural Resources Committee in the Senate, and water legislation goes through them. And every session has some sort of water legislation introduced, some of it very important. And I'm sure some has been introduced or is going to be introduced for the 2023 session starting in January. I didn't have a chance to check on it and see, but I would be curious to see what is being proposed. I'm sure there's something. So I want to talk about some of the different entities that have to do with regulation of the water in Texas. One of them is the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. So this is the state's primary environmental regulatory agency. It sets the standards for surface water quality for bodies of water in the state, and it implements those standards. It monitors and assesses surface water resources like rivers, reservoirs, things like that. And it regulates sources of pollution. It is responsible for processing and acting on applications for permits to use the state's surface water, and applications for transferring surface water from one river basin to another. The Texas Parks and Wildlife Department is also a little bit important for water regulation in Texas. It's a state agency. Its primary responsibility is protecting fish and wildlife resources. So it regulates recreational fishing, commercial fishing on the coast, but it also makes recommendations to the entity I mentioned on the previous slide, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, on scheduling of in-stream flows and freshwater inflows to Texas estuaries for the management of fish and wildlife resources. In-stream flow is the freshwater flowing in rivers or streams. Freshwater inflow is the freshwater that flows into an estuary. So the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department has some input on those water issues, water regulation issues. Now, the Texas Water Development Board is really important, and probably what I spent most of my time dealing with here. It was created in 1957, and it is the state agency that is primarily responsible for water planning and administering water financing for the state. So its primary mission is to support the planning, the conservation, and the development of water in Texas. It also provides loans to local governments for water supply projects, water quality projects like wastewater treatment, pollution control projects, flood control projects, conservation projects, and things like that. And the fourth state entity, the last state entity that I want to mention, is the Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board. It implements the Texas Soil Conservation Law, which is meant to combat soil erosion. It was also given the job about 50 years ago in the 1970s of being the main Texas state agency for addressing or regulating non-point source pollution from agricultural and mining operations and timbering operations. non-point solution and point solution are two terms that come from federal law, and they talk about types of pollution. And this picture I found does a good job of distinguishing them. So non-point solution is pollution, excuse me. Let me start the other way around. Point source pollution comes from discrete pipes flowing into a river. So here at the bottom of the picture, you have point pollution coming from the factory, maybe coming from the feedlot, maybe coming from the wastewater treatment plant. There are usually pipes leading right into it. Actually, the feedlot in this picture would be a non-point source. But the non-point sources might be homes, city streets, suburban developments. Cropland would be a big, big, big one. And so the water just it doesn't flow out through a pipe. It's not deliberately poured into the stream, but it comes out through overflow and through stuff like that. And so this Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board is in charge of regulating all that. Now, there are also several types of regional entities, and they're very important. And I want to talk about each one of them a little bit. Groundwater conservation districts, river authorities. The Edwards Aquifer Authority is a specific groundwater conservation district. It was created about 25 years ago. The Harris-Galveston Coastal Subsidence District is another one, a specific groundwater conservation district that was created recently. There are also regional planning groups, so I'll mention those real quickly as well. So, groundwater conservation districts are very important to understand. They were created by the Texas legislature, or authorized by the legislature, to provide for the conservation, preservation, protection, recharge, and prevention of waste of groundwater and groundwater reservoirs. So a groundwater conservation district has the authority to regulate the spacing of water wells and sometimes the production from water wells, how much water can actually be pumped. This entity is the state's preferred method of managing groundwater resources, and there are currently 98 groundwater conservation districts in Texas. They were created to respond to or mitigate some of the problems that result from our system of groundwater ownership. So in Texas, groundwater withdrawals operate generally under the rule of capture. An important concept to understand. The rule of capture. So, the rule of capture is the basic groundwater law for Texas that allows the surface owner of land to pump an unlimited amount of groundwater from his or her land. So if I own 10 acres and there's water underneath my land, right? I own the surface and there's water underneath my land, then I own as much of that water as I can pump out, right? And if I and my neighbors are all landowners on top of the same reservoir of groundwater, we can each pump out, from our own parcel of land as much as we want, as much as we need. Maybe if we have a farm or an orchard or whatever, we can do whatever we can. The basic rule of capture is as much as I can get out of my pump, out of my well, is mine, right, with no limit. Groundwater conservation districts are basically a modification of that rule, right? They can make basic requirements of spacing of wells, and like I said, in some places even limitations on how much can be pumped in order to preserve the groundwater, the aquifer. where the water is. So the GCDs, or groundwater conservation districts, enact rules and regulations, including requiring permits, metering, and limitations on the amount of water that may be withdrawn in their area. For example, in Bexar County and counties to the east and west, pumping from the Edwards Aquifer is regulated by the Edwards Aquifer Authority. And in the Houston-Galveston area, pumping is regulated by the Harris-Galveston Coastal Subsidence Districts. And in some other groundwater conservation districts, the amount of pumping is regulated as well. This map shows all of the groundwater districts in Texas, all 98 of them. And you can see most of Texas is covered. The white spaces are not. I want to talk about a few of these groundwater conservation districts. So the High Plains Underwater Water Conservation District was the first groundwater conservation district in Texas. It was created in 1951, and it is the largest. It is in the Panhandle. It serves 11,850 square miles of land across 16 counties, and like I said, it was created in 1951, so it's the oldest one in Texas. About 2.5 million acres of farmland in this High Plains Water Conservation District use groundwater for irrigation purposes. So a lot of farmland depends on water in this district. Now, river authorities are another kind of, or one kind of regional entity, but obviously this is surface water, right, not groundwater. So the Texas legislature created river authorities, and river authorities now control the rights to more than 70% of the state's surface water. There are over 20 river authorities in Texas, and their primary function is to distribute and conserve the state's surface water. The water that the river authorities regulate is either sold to consumers, like households and businesses, or to other suppliers of water. It can be sold to municipal and county water suppliers, private water companies, etc. So many parts of the state receive water directly or indirectly from a river authority. One interesting thing about river authorities, they don't receive direct legislative appropriations, so the state doesn't give them money in the budget. They support themselves, sustain themselves by selling the water or the byproducts of water, and that's the majority of their revenue. Now back to aquifers. So Texas has numerous aquifers capable of producing groundwater for households, municipalities, industry, farms, and ranches. The Texas Water Development Board recognizes 9 major aquifers and 22 minor aquifers. And these are a critical source of water for Texas. They supplied 62% of the water used in the state in 2014. About 70% of that water was used for irrigation, and about 36%, that math isn't right. So it would be about 25%, I think, was used to meet municipal demands, like cities. Now, the Ogallala Aquifer is a fascinating aquifer. It is the largest in the United States, and it is a major aquifer in Texas as well. It provides significantly more water than any other aquifer in the state, and it is critical to the economy of the region. So in the part of Texas where you can see the aquifer spreads, 95% of the water that's pumped out of it is used for irrigation for farming. Now the problem that's interesting, a problem that's being talked about all over the Great Plains, not just in Texas, Nebraska, Kansas, Texas as well, is that groundwater withdrawals are exceeding the amount of recharge, meaning people are pumping out more water, primarily to use for irrigation, than is naturally replenished. And so water levels have been depleting over time, have been declining over time, over the last 50 or 60 years. Large-scale extraction of water for agriculture started after World War II. And it is at risk of over-extraction and pollution. Since 1950, agricultural irrigation has reduced the volume of the aquifer by an estimated 9%. And if it is ever depleted, the aquifer will take about 6,000 years to replenish naturally. So once gone, it will be essentially gone forever. To give you an idea of how important the water in the aquifer is, about 27% of the irrigated land in the United States is over this aquifer. So about 1/4 of our irrigated farmland is irrigated from the water there in the Ogallala. Also, it supplies drinking water to about 82% of the 2.3 million people who live in that area. So what would the math be? Somewhere near 2 million people, right? Maybe a little under 2 million people also depend upon the aquifer for drinking water. In the North Plains Groundwater Conservation District, that's north of Lubbock in the Texas Panhandle, they've been talking about and trying two approaches to dealing with this problem. So one is at a cost of about $300,000 a year. They started a demonstration project in 2010 where they get local farmers to volunteer to try new farming techniques that will hopefully raise the same crops or the same amount of crops with half as much water. So they use different kinds of irrigation that are hopefully more efficient. They also try what they call is dry farming. So the planting is done in dry rather than pre-watered earth. And they leave larger spaces between plants and leave old stalks in the fields, even as new plants spring up, which is a technique that can hold the moisture in the earth longer. They also use new technology like soil sensors, and that's what this guy is doing here. He's using a soil sensor which can measure precisely the amount of moisture in the earth and can send messages to him remotely, like on his cell phone. So they do all those things, and the reason they have to conserve is that the North Plains Groundwater Conservation District back in 2005 began imposing pumping limits. So they have 400 wells in their district, and they had to start telling farmers the water is so low in the aquifer here in this part of Texas that we have to put limits now on how much pumping you can do, and that helped give them an incentive to try some of these conservation techniques. Another aquifer that's interesting is the Edwards Aquifer Authority, or the Edwards Aquifer is regulated by the Edwards Aquifer Authority. This is the source of water for millions of people in Bexar County, which is around San Antonio, and the surrounding areas. So the Edwards Aquifer Authority was created by the Texas legislature to manage, conserve, preserve, and protect the aquifer, to increase the recharge to the aquifer, the replenishment of the aquifer, and to prevent waste or pollution. So currently there are about 1.7 million water users in 8 counties in the Edwards Aquifer Authority's jurisdiction. So the Edwards Aquifer Authority also, like the North Plains one I just mentioned, issues permits specifying the amounts of water that can be withdrawn from the aquifer. And it imposes and enforces regulations over its jurisdiction. And so these are attempts to keep the aquifer replenished. The Harris-Galveston Subsidence District also limits how much groundwater can be withdrawn in Harris County, which is surrounding Houston, and Galveston County. And they were motivated to do this because several decades ago, back in the 70s, they noticed that the ground was actually subsiding. In other words, with the pumping out of water, the ground was falling. And this, in order to prevent significant subsidence of the earth, they decided to create this district in order to limit pumping of the water from underground. Now, regional planning groups were established in 1998 after a drought that kind of startled policymakers in Texas. And so what they did here was the Texas Water Development Board divided the state into 16 regions that you can see on this map. And each region is responsible for making a water plan for its region. And then the Texas Water Development Board kind of consolidates these regional plans and makes a state water plan that's updated every 5 years. And in 2022, we just got an update for the state water plan, and I'll talk about it a little bit at the end of the lecture. So, there are also local entities, many local entities that supply water to us. So municipal water suppliers are operated or established by city government, and they provide water to city residents and often to suburban communities. And they set the water rates for their customers, and they provide more water than any other entity. So most of us in Texas probably get our water directly from a municipal water supplier, a city water supplier. There are also these other things though. A municipal utility district, or MUD, is a nonprofit political subdivision created for the purposes of providing water, wastewater, and other services. And many people who live in suburban areas outside the boundaries of a municipality live in areas served by MUDs. There are about 600 of them in Texas. Water supply corporations are nonprofit entities that provide potable, meaning drinkable water, and or sewer service to their members. So if you're not served by a municipality, you might become a member of a water service corporation, like a part owner of this nonprofit corporation. And as a member, you would pay a membership fee, $50, $250 maybe, and you would be entitled to get water for your membership. There are also private water suppliers. These are private water companies, basically, that work for a profit. There are also water control and improvement districts, which were created by the Texas legislature in the 1920s to supply treated and untreated water, provide wastewater service, flood control, oversee irrigation and navigation, and so forth. Special utility districts are kind of like water supply corporations, but they are local government districts. They're exempt from sales and property taxes. They have reduced interest rates. They qualify for preferred loans and grants. And last, a freshwater supply district can be created for the purpose of providing and distributing water for domestic and commercial use. Now, last, I want to talk about this topic that I've hinted at the beginning and all along, future water shortages. This is a picture of Falcon Dam in Roma, Texas, which is down in the valley on the border. And this is from this year, from this summer, past summer, where water levels were at the lowest they had been in 2 decades. And you can see here the water is supposed to be, up to here. But the water level was so low that the dam couldn't even function properly. So many areas of Texas are experiencing record low water levels in aquifers, lakes, and rivers. In 2022, this year, the Nueces and Frio rivers experienced 0 water flow in certain parts. So the rivers just stopped flowing. There wasn't enough water for that. Along the southern border of Texas at Falcon Lake, seen in this picture, levels are so low that the water is no longer able to properly flow through the dam. And the state's groundwater supplies, which provide water for most of West Texas and a lot of East Texas, are decreasing at an alarming rate. Presently, groundwater supplies provide almost 60% of our state's water demand, but these supplies are predicted to decrease 20% by 2050. There'll be just 20% less water in the ground. Some people have suggested, organizations that have studied the issue, that the current rate of groundwater pumping is unsustainable. We're simply pumping more water out of the ground than is naturally replenished. I've mentioned the Ogallala Aquifer. That's the largest one in the country and in the state of Texas. It is expected to experience a 50% decline in groundwater levels over the next 50 years, by 2070. And other aquifers in Texas are also expected to decline significantly in that same period. So the Texas Water Development Board, I told you they make a plan every 5 years called the State Water Plan. And they plan for the future. They try to plan 50 years ahead. So they have estimated that over the next 30 years, our population is going to increase from 29 million people in Texas to 47 million people. And they've estimated that over the next 50 years, our water supply will decline. Groundwater, I already said, will decline by 20%. And overall, the water supply will decline by about 18%. So we'll have about 4/5 of the water available, right? If nothing is done. About 4/5 of the water that's available today. Now, they've also predicted that Texas's demand for water will increase because we'll have a growing population. So we'll need more water, but we'll have about 20% less available. And a lot of that will come from growth. Almost all of that will be driven by the growth in demand and municipal demand for water. And remember, municipal means cities, right? So basically, the people who live in the big cities like Houston, Dallas, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, maybe to a lesser extent San Antonio and Austin, those are going to be the big drivers. They're going to be needing more and more and more water by 2070, but there will be less of it available. And you can see that in this chart. It shows demand in the red line here for municipal demand, and notice it just grows at a much higher rate than any other chart here. And by 2070, they're predicting what will be 8 million acre feet of water will be necessary for municipalities. Now, currently, Texas uses most of its water for irrigation. In 2020, irrigation is the biggest demand, but they're predicting that that will be surpassed by municipal demand for water by 2070. This is a different chart that just shows kind of the same information. Municipal demand is the red bar with kind of white dots, and whereas the irrigation kind of stays the same, right? It grows by 2030 and then it remains fairly stable. Municipal demand for water is expected to just grow and grow and grow. Now the Texas Water Development Board has come up with strategies for addressing this, for getting more water and conserving more water. And it estimates that those strategies, if implemented, will cost about $80 billion over the next 50 years. And if we don't do anything, it's estimated that there will be economic, job, and population losses that go along with this water loss. So this is from the Texas Controller's website. They estimated, using Texas Water Development Board data, that the income loss would be about $153 billion in 2070. So that's the bar, that's the chart on the left. The 2070 bar is about $153 billion. They estimate that the job loss will be about 1,371,000 jobs. And they estimate that the population loss will be about 252,000 people. And what that means is people will leave Texas because there won't be enough water to sustain them here. This chart is kind of complicated, but the one thing I wanted you to see here, this is another way of looking at these forecasts, these predictions. In 2070, they've estimated this purple bar showing the amount of demand for water, and the blue shows what they think existing supplies will be if nothing is done, right? If the current trends continue. The red shows how much would be needed to make up the gap, and the green shows the strategies that they've come up with now in 2022 to try to find the necessary water over the next 50 years, produce enough to meet what we expect the demand to be. So what do they recommend? They recommend that we find that necessary amount of water in different ways, through surface water, demand management, which means conservation, reuse of water, recycling used water, right? Groundwater, seawater, which will be usable through desalination. You have a process of taking the salt out of the water so it can be used, and aquifer use. Let me show you a couple of things. So the Texas Water Development Board, one of its recommendations is that we build 23 new reservoirs. Texas has not had a new reservoir in about 20 years or so. And the expectation was that these new reservoirs would provide the state about 2 million acre feet of water per year by 2070. And you don't need to know what an acre foot of water is by any stretch, but if you're curious, it's about 330,000 gallons of water, I think. So one new reservoir started construction in 2018 and is set to start delivering water by late 2022. I just checked yesterday, but I didn't see if it's delivering water yet or not. But this will be the first major Texas reservoir in about 30 years. And you can see it on this map here. It's up near the Oklahoma border, north of Bonham. And you can see the timeline. Here it says water delivery scheduled for the spring of 2023. But it will be a huge reservoir, I think that says 16,000 acres. So, and it'll have boating and recreational activities like other reservoirs, like Lake Palestine, like Lake Athens. But its most important job is that once it's finished, it will be expected to provide 82 million gallons per day of water. And that water, you can't see it here, but it will mostly be used by the Dallas-Fort Worth area, where the demand is expected to keep growing and growing over the next several decades. This last page shows you where they want. On the left, it shows you existing reservoir locations. All those little dots are reservoirs, those little gray dots all over Texas. And on the right, the proposed new reservoirs that they hope we construct over the next 50 years, and they hope we start right away to provide more water over the next 50 years. Some of them have already begun construction, like Bodark Lake that I just showed you. Some of them are in the designing stage and the planning stage. Some of them, the little blue dots, they haven't even issued permits yet. So those are still the very, very, very beginning stages of development. And that's all for today. I'll see you next week.